Jerry received his PhD from Iowa State University in 1975 in the area of agricultural climatology and statistics, and a master's in agronomy from the University of Kentucky in 1972. He was appointed laboratory director of the National Soil Tilth Laboratory in 1989, and that was later renamed the Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment in October 2009. Dr. Hatfield's research emphasis is on the interactions among the components of soil, plant, atmosphere continuum, and their linkage to air, water, and soil quality. His focus has been on the evaluation of farming systems and their response to water and nitrogen interactions across soils, as well as the evaluation of remote sensing methods to quantify spatial variation within fields for application to risk management tools. Dr. Hatfield is the author of 448 refereed publications and the editor of 18 monographs. He served as the lead author on the effects of climate change on agriculture, land resources, water resources, and biodiversity, and a member of the IPCC process that received the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Additionally, he was contributing author on agriculture for the State of Knowledge Report, Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. He is a fellow of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, the Soil Science Society of America. He is also the past president of the American Society of Agronomy and member of the American Meteorological Society, American Geophysical Union, and Soil and Water Conservation Society. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2011 Conservation Research Award from the Soil and Water Conservation Society, ARS Hall of Fame in 2014, and the Hugh Hammond Bennett Award from the Soil and Water Conservation Society in 2016, and a Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Service in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jerry Hatfield.
Thanks, Cassie, and thank you for all you being here today. We're going to kind of explore maybe a little different topic and to begin to kick off this seminar series, and have to acknowledge the fact that Cassie was able to rearrange the schedule for this because I made a very bad mistake last week. Last week was our wedding anniversary, and for me to be here on the 30th would have been a little bit problematic. So anyway, we're going to explore the whole idea of the yield gap, all these different things that go with it, the challenges for you and the opportunities in terms of closing this yield gap as we begin to think about it. But I want to get everybody on the same foot because there's so many different perceptions when you go out and you talk to producers about yield gaps or you talk to other people about yield gaps. All of them have a different perception, and so I'll give you the definitions. You got actual yield, that's what the producer gets. And you got attainable yield, which we will define as the highest county yield for a given year. And then the potential yield is a maximum yield under all optimum conditions, water, nutrients, and things like this. That's what geneticists play with in terms of all the different confined factors. And then the yield gap can either be actual, attainable minus actual, or potential minus actual in terms of this. And just to kind of put it in a pictograph for you in terms of looking at this, if we think about corn, genetic potential may be close to that 600 bushels per acre that people talk about. Soybeans in that 200 bushel. Wheat we could put at that 200 and 225 bushel. But now you get down to attainable yield. You know, counties 250 at an average county yield is pretty good. And then you get down to actual yield, we may be at that 176, 175 area where we come in at that. You see where soybeans fit in this whole piece. So we lose a lot between potential and actual in all of this. And if we really want to think about this from a different viewpoint, and that is, we're not going to change the potentials much on this. So if we want to feed the world into the future, it's really about how we change the actuals. How do we really begin to think about changing that actual yield that's out there? There are a lot of resources on this. In fact, there's a whole yield gap atlas that's been written. Patricio Grassini is author of a lot of this in terms of that yield gaps. And you'll see all sorts of different terms that get floated about. Yield potential, water limiting yield potential, yield gaps, water productivity, they're all derived from crop simulation models. There's a whole book put together by Fisher, Byerly, and Eames on yield gaps, and I just pulled out from that book, which is about 500 pages. Tony Fisher went through and basically spent a year surveying the world, looking at yields, yield gaps, what closed that, all the different things, and this is just kind of a synopsis out of that book. The yield gap on wheat's about 49% on the average, with a range of about 29 to 69%. The closure is they're closing at about 2%, or 0.2% a year, with a range from -1 to actually losing ground. Maize, yield gap's about 36% in Iowa and about 96% in China. They've got some really low yields in lots of different parts of that. Rice, irrigated and rain-fed are entirely different in terms of yield gaps. Soybeans are about 30%, and pulses, if you look at Fisher's et al.'s book, is about 100% yield gap. So there's a lot of room for improvement as we begin to think about their definitions and all of this. The question that will start with this whole process is, how can we use yield gaps to help producers understand where yield's being lost? How can you really use this as a tool to help really begin to go forward and say, here's where you're losing, here's where you're gaining, all the different things to put management into a different perspective. And then can we utilize this understanding to improve the stability in crop production? If you were, and I'll show you some yield graphs as we go along, as we know that there's a lot of variation in yield among years. And in reality, on a worldwide basis, we shouldn't be thinking so much about the average yield, but reducing that variation about that yield. Because that's where a lot of the food security will come from, yield stability in terms of the overall process from that standpoint. And so you've got field yield, you've got this water limited potential yield, you've got yield gaps as percent of field yield, all these different things. And if you start reading the literature, you find out a lot of these terms just get floated about in all sorts of different ways. What we've been doing in an analytical approach is that we've been using the Nass County data. And the reason we've been using the Nass County data, it's available, it's free, all you got to do is have patience to bring it all down. And we've used it since 1950, although these data go back a number of years. In fact, on corn for the U.S. goes back to the 1860s. Wheat goes back to the 1860s. But the reason we use from 1950 onwards is I consider that the modern era of agriculture. That's where we introduced hybrids, we introduced fertilizer technology, we introduced a lot of modern farming practices, and that's where yields really began to take off. If you look across the whole yield atlas across the United States on corn, you actually see from 1865 through 1940 that yields were fairly flat and actually had begun to decrease a little bit. And now and then they took off with the introduction of hybrids, the fertilizers, all the different things that we put with that. We use, and I'll show this, we use an upper frontier analysis to define the attainable yield, and then we just compute the yield gap as the attainable minus the actual. Pictorially, this is just Story County soybeans. You can look at all that variation that goes on. And then this is a frontier through those points, and we consider those points as the ones in which weather was not a real significant limitation for that year. And this dashed line is the yield gap that's in there. And you can see there are very interesting points along that process in this. And so we've actually computed this for all 677 counties of the Midwest, which is just ad nauseum in terms of all this. So you don't get to see all 677 counties multiplied by both corn and beans across this. Sorry to disappoint you from that standpoint. Here's the end of Adams County, Indiana, and the reason I pull this one out, here's the attainable yield gap in there. But what gets more interesting is when you start looking at this not on a bushel per acre basis, but on how much production is really lost on a year in a given county. And if you want to make policymakers excited, you convert all of that production to lost revenue. because lost revenue is lost tax revenue. So if you want to explain this to policymakers, it's not about bushels lost, it's about dollars lost. And it's about the fact that you realize that you're losing, this is in Kansas, about $1 billion a year in lost revenue because of the yield gap in wheat. And then you go, this is a problem, isn't it? Yes. It's a problem when it's in money. In bushels per acre, it's not, it just doesn't have much meaning to them. It means a lot to producer, doesn't mean anything to a policymaker. So you look at this. This is just some data that we did on Kentucky wheat. Looking at the yield gap in there, looking at stability of wheat, and I'll explain why that's there. And then here's the value. We plotted this out in terms of dollars lost on particular years across that. And you begin to see just how big, on a statewide basis, some of these values begin to be. You think about 25 bushels per acre, but you start multiplying it by all the acres that are within a state by $4 or $5 per bushel. You know, there's a lot of revenue that's lost in this. And that's lost revenue to the producers as well. Here's one that we did on Kansas, Oklahoma, and North Dakota, because we were very interested in what was happening across the Midwest. And we're happening because we made this statement back in 2014. We talked about the wheat belt. And with the rising temperatures in the wheat belt and the Great Plains, that winter wheat would actually be moving northward. Because it would no longer be profitable to grow wheat in the southern parts of Texas, Oklahoma. And so we went through and just did a yield gap analysis on this. You can see Oklahoma at the top. These are actually statewide yields. You can actually see that we really haven't gained a whole lot of yield potential in there. There's very few good years in Oklahoma. Yield gaps are quite substantial in this. Kansas wheat, we had a really good story going until 2016. 2016 was this year right here. And from 2000 to 2015, Kansas wheat yields had actually been going down. And they'd been going down for particular reasons. One is that rainfall patterns, a number of different things. And then the 2016 year came and it was a record yield in that. So you just look at all these different pieces that are going on. North Dakota, yield trends are up there, but what we were looking at is what was the real difference in all of this, and what we begin to see is that yield gap in the Great Plains is really a function of when rainfall occurs during the grain filling period. That's a simple factor that Oklahoma wheat yields were related to basically April and May precipitation. Kansas wheat yields was April, May, and early June. North Dakota is really June or late June, July, August, because it's late maturing. So you could just trot that up across the Great Plains and see where the factor was. There are occasional years across the Great Plains in which late frost hits that crop, but those are relatively rare compared to the lack of moisture. And so when we think about all of this in terms of the yield gap, it really gets to the point of how do we begin to manage the water content in all of this. And we went through, this is just Kentucky data, this is corn, soybeans, and wheat. We plotted out the actual attainable yields. And you see that in reality, from 1950 onwards, we really haven't closed the yield gap much. We've closed it a little bit, but in reality, there's years in which we have big departures, and they are spread throughout that whole period of time, throughout the period of record. So the observations that you need to be taking away is that yield gaps are lost income to the producer. You really think about their failure to reach attainable yields each year is basically lost income. It's lost bushels, but it's really lost income. And that gets producers much more interested in having a conversation about it. It also represents an inefficiency in production, and this is where agronomists come in, because it's an inefficiency in production because if we really think about the return on investment, we've invested nutrients, we've invested seed, we've invested in pesticides, and when we have low yields, we don't get a return on investment. So we have a production inefficiency from that standpoint, and we really haven't closed that yield gap over time. You look at those numbers that Fisher came out across all the world, is 0.2%, 0.1% at times. We're not closing that yield gap with any regularity and with any significant change in what we're going on. So you have to ask yourself as agronomist, are we really doing the right thing and thinking about this problem? Are we really doing all the things that we can do to close this yield gap from that standpoint? So now you have to ask yourself, so if you got all this different doom and gloom things out there, what causes the yield gaps? What are the things within the growing season that really cause this difference between the attainable yield and the actual yield, or genetic potential and actual yield as well? And so what we've done, and I'll just go back to Story County, and this is maize and everything. There's the attainable yield, the actual yield, and the yield gap. But what we find is that when we start doing frequency analyses of these, is that these yield gaps are really what I call the short-term stresses. The short-term stresses are those that occur because 20% of that yield gap is occurring about 80% of the time. That's that old 80%, 20% rule. We see that same thing on the yield gaps. And we see they're due to short-term stresses. And short-term stresses are not the drought years of 1988, 2012. They're not the early frost years that hammer us. The yield gaps are really, from a management perspective, are these short-term stresses that are due to needing 2 inches of water to satisfy all the ET demand during that week and only getting an inch of rainfall. So that crop's under a little bit of stress all the time. It's the nickel and dime effect. We just slowly chew away at yield. It's not that catastrophic event, and it just kind of disappears slowly. And you look at a lot of that yield gap, it basically falls in this category. But it also says that if it's that case, that 20% of that yield gap is due to these short-term stresses, what can the producer do to manage around that? And you begin to think about these processes that are going on from that standpoint. So we found that there's all sorts of factors related to these yield gaps. Weather, obviously, management, genetics, and soil. And if you really think about this, everybody knows the impacts of weather. And we could spend the rest of the whole afternoon talking about the weather impacts. The management impacts, one of the things that we do see that there is a difference between producers and how they manage that. That actually, what got us down some of these treks was observing producers that were doing the same thing with the same hybrids in the same county with different yields on their farms. And there was a management impact that was really causing that. Timing of nutrients, timing of planting, paying attention to a lot of the different things that are going on. So we often underestimate just what role management has. Genetics has an impact in all of this. You know, we continue to add to that yield over time by genetic improvement and technological improvement. And then the soil is really a major factor. We underestimate what role soil really plays in terms of these yield gaps and how it's changing. So we went back and we did an analysis, and this is really busy, but what we did is these are cropping district level now, because we're looking at climatic analyses, is that we looked at the different factors going on across. This is just Illinois data and some Iowa data, is that maximum temperatures in July, minimum temperatures in August, and July-August precipitation were the three factors that were most related to yield gaps on the cropping district level from 1950 through 2015 when we completed this analysis. July maximum temperatures goes back to some of Mark Westgate's work showing the impact of maximum temperatures on efficiency of the pollination process. And you see that come through. August minimum temperatures are really about the efficiency of that grain filling process and lengthening or shortening the duration of the grain filling. We see these really warm years. We see a collapsed grain filling period, reduced yields, all due to minimum temperatures during that August period, and then obviously July-August precipitation. And so you look at all of this and you begin to see these dynamics that are going on in this, and these are the dominant factors in all of this. We tried all sorts of different things from a climatic viewpoint, because what we wanted to do is say, if our climate continues to change, and these factors are part of the yield gap process, what will the Midwest look like in 25, 50 years from now? And so this is just fraction of attainable yield for the Midwest maize. These are yield gaps anywhere from 75% of potential, or 25% of obtainable yield, all the way to 65%. You see in southern Illinois that you're going to have yield gaps of 75% in all of this. So if you project that out into 2025, which is only a few years from now, people, we're already beginning to show that we could be at half of what we think we could be producing just because of these changing weather combinations that are out there. And then by 2075, look how much redder that gets. So you really look at this, you look forward in this as we move north. And as you move north and west into North Dakota and South Dakota, where we push the corn belt and the soybean belt, they're moving into areas that have lower July temperatures and cooler August temperatures. The August temperatures are actually the driving factor in these southern parts of Illinois and Indiana, because that's the temperature that's going to rise the most. It's not so much the maximums, but actually the minimum temperatures that are. Soybeans, same thing, but that yield gap's only about 40%. Still not going to be a yield that shakes the world on fire, but it becomes realistic. It says, how do we begin to think about managing this system when now weather is going to have a major impact on taking our yield potential and moving it away from where we think it is? So what we've been looking at in all of this is what we call the genetics by environment by management interaction, the G by E by M. And think about it this way from the agronomic perspective. Management is what you oversee, environment is what you're trying to overcome, because genetics is what you're trying to optimize. You think about it that way, and if you really look at it from the production point of view, management is the factors that we do oversee. We put it into play, we look at a lot of different things that go with that. The environment is what we're trying to overcome. We're trying to overcome the effects of weather. We're trying to overcome the effects of soil variation that's out there. This just happens to be one of the fields that we work in, and all that's just water holding capacity. We've seen too many of those this summer in terms of rainfall events, in terms of high intensity precipitation, and then the genetics that are out there. So you really begin to think about this in terms of overseeing, in terms of management, is where agronomists really have our opportunities as well as our challenges. But here's the really interesting news in all of this is when we talk about closing the yield gap, there is no single factor. There is no silver bullet in the yield gap that says, okay, if I do this, I'm going to close my yield gap by 50%. It is going to require an integration of genetics, environment, and management. It's going to require an understanding of what environment's really doing to that crop, but also where do we get to take the most opportunities for management decisions. Genetics, I think we're going to have to really begin to look and say, how do we begin to optimize our genetic resources into the environment that we want? And a lot of the work that goes on with G by E and just by genetics by environment. In the environment, we can't control the weather, but we can manage the soil. And one of the things that we don't talk enough about is what role soil has in terms of this overall process. And in management, irrigated systems have actually shown the largest gain in closing the yield gap. If we can control the water, we can control a lot of our yield potential in the gap. But if we're reliant on summer rainfall, then that management of that soil really becomes the important part of this process. So it becomes a very interesting dynamic when we think about this. I'm just going to point it out this way to you. This is a field that's just west of here. This is an image that was taken in early August. And that same field with an image taken in late August. That's 3 weeks apart. There's hardly any variation in that field in early August. It was nice and green, and soybeans were about this tall. This is late August. You see all that decline of leaf area in there. This was the yields that were pulled out of that field, 65 bushels in this area and 25 bushels in that area. So we lost 40 bushels the acre in the 3-week period because it didn't rain. And if we're relying on summer rainfall, these become the currents because one of the climate trends is that July, August precipitation is going to become more variable. There's another one where we can show these again ad nauseum. Everybody has yield maps. These are the low parts of the field that's a poor quality soils. These are the good parts of the field. They're scattered throughout all that field. And we've done other analysis. This is the relationship between what we've done in management and the only factor that we could begin to see is when we had poor soils in part of the field, did we get to see a real good correlation of how we were managing nitrogen within that. Water trumps nitrogen. Sorry to disappoint all the nitrogen people, but you know, that's a cruel fact of life. You know, so you look at all this, we see these different pieces. We know that there's all this variation of water holding capacity within these fields. And if you really look at this, one of the discoveries that we made was that fields are extremely uniform at tasseling. They're extremely uniform at full cover in soybeans. And the variation within that field begins to appear during the grain filling period. They begin to appear because we're now reliant upon precipitation to refill that profile, and rainfall is becoming more variable. So we're really reliant on what's stored within that profile, and the poor parts of the field just don't have the water to supply and meet crop water demand. It's a simple fact in all of this. This is why irrigation shows it's a big advantage. We did another analysis in which I call this good soils equal good yields. This was an analysis that we did across Kentucky, Iowa, and Kansas, or Nebraska, I mean. The x-axis is the National Crop Commodity Productivity Index. It is an index that NRCS has in its database. It basically describes the quality of soils and their suitability for corn and soybean production. It actually is much more robust than the CSR ratings because they have all sorts of quantitative aspects to them. We plotted it against county yields. And this is 50 years of data. This is the average over the 50 years. You can see, and I'll point out that an NCCPI index of 0 is this floor. That's the quality it has for growing corn or soybeans. A quality of 1 is a really high quality soil. And you can look at this and say, well, gee, I kind of know that. The better the soil, the higher the average county yield. And then we got Nebraska. And Nebraska does not know how to grow soybeans any better than Iowa. But we only selected irrigated counties. If you can control the water, the quality of the soil doesn't mean much. But if you can't control the water, the quality of the soil has everything to do with how you're getting your yields. And what we find is that as we work with producers on this, is that they often manage their crops as though they have a 0.8 NCCPI, when in reality they have a 0.5. So they're losing inputs, they're losing efficiency out of that system. They're basically not managing it the right way. So we have an education effort to do. This is the the relationship for corn. Across that, we didn't put Nebraska in that. It was already, the point was already made in terms of this piece. And there are points along this in which, if we plotted the error bars along that, there's actually some of those years in which there's been 0 yield in counties in Kentucky. That's really prompted the state of Kentucky to really begin to think differently about their cropping systems, and on really poor soils is moving away from corn to actually wheat. Because you can get wheat growing, you can get it matured before the dry period sets in. They've even developed, the state has funded or helped support a flour mill to come in to have a market for that wheat. So we may have to start looking at various things like this if we continue to have these types of situations. And just to put it in perspective, this is the county level NCCPI across the Midwest. This is only on agricultural soils within that. And we are called the Corn Belt for a really good reason. These are the high quality soils. If we move south, we're moving into poorer soils. We move north, we're going to move into poorer soils as well. Actually, if we move north and west, we're moving into poorer soils. North Dakota and South Dakota are not noted for the really high quality soils when it comes to those productions. And so we can see a lot of variation in those as well. And as we move east, we're not moving into really high quality soils. So that's why we see a lot of yield variation in this. We start looking across all those counties to really begin to understand the dynamics of what goes on. So we're going to think about our soils just from a standpoint that if our opportunity lies in improving the capacity of that soil to absorb water and store water, is that we need to think about just the quality of that soil from a different viewpoint. And I'll just use two simple illustrations in this. This is a soil with a low biological activity. It may have aggregates, but they're not very stable, and as soon as that raindrop hits it, it begins to dissolve, and as it dissolves, it runs down and clogs all these pores, and then we get runoff. And so we have infiltration rates of less than a ½ inch per hour. And so the question really is, to a producer, is it's not how much rain you get in the rain gauge, it's how much rain you get in the soil. There's a difference between 6 inches of rain in that rain gauge and 6 inches of rain in that soil. And we have a lot of soils in which after 1 inch, we already have runoff. And we see that all the time. So we're slowly destroying the capacity of our fields to absorb water from lots of different viewpoints. A really high biological activity soil, stable aggregate in there, raindrop hits it. We still got that channels that move that water down through that. We see really high infiltration rates in excess sometimes of 4 inches per hour. And so we can see all of this. And so we really got to think about managing this soil to be able to handle the water dynamics that are going on. But here's the other piece in all of this, and this is some analysis that Christian Dodd and Tom Sauer and I, because we have these fields where we have long-term observation flux stations. This is we took all the flux stations, we took it from 2000 to 2016, and then we sampled that soil in 2005 on a 50-meter grid down to 1.2 meters. We sampled it again in 2016 on that same grid. This is with the eddy correlation. This is the carbon budget. You see that there's really no difference in all of this. We isolated those grid points of that soil sample, even though they extend that whole field, just into the footprint of that flux tower. And we see that we're constantly losing carbon out of that system. What we consider, and this is a field that is typical of the Midwest, maybe a little cultivation in the spring or in the fall anhydrous. We've now moved it to spring anhydrous, a couple field cultivations in the spring, no residue removed, and yet we're still losing carbon. That's roughly 1,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year. Silage fields lose 4,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year. So we're constantly degrading our soils and continually degrading this. So we're not changing our soils very dramatically. In fact, we're slipping. And what we can continue to see is that if we don't protect our soils, our yield gap's going to get bigger and bigger. We won't have any chance of closing that yield gap because one of the components of management in the environment is how do we begin to manage soil water. If you just look at it from this perspective, this is organic matter versus available water content. The more organic matter, the higher the available water content. But I'm going to explain it to you this way. This is organic matter, and this is days of available water to that corn plant during August, during the grain filling period. Roughly assumed about 5 millimeters per day as a maximum evaporation rate, 2% in a 5-foot profile. 2% is that we have about 8 days. You take that up to 4%, you've got 13 days. The probability of having a rainfall event, if you go from 8 to 13 days, is pretty high. even in our variable rainfall pattern. So organic matter is worth soil water to you. The other piece of this is how do we maintain the residue on that surface, which then really changes the overall dynamic of what goes on, because now we've suppressed the soil water evaporation rate and we put all that water into that crop. Because what we're really about in agriculture is harvesting water and harvesting sunshine. Think about all the corn and soybeans that we pull off. It's basically you've converted water and sunshine into a product. Yield gaps, and according to this, is that if you look at North America, the yield gap's been closed by higher plant densities. Reduced tillage, as Fisher found that was one of the things that closed yield gaps, and genetic improvement. That was one of the things that closed it. But in sub-Saharan Africa, it was really about fertility, weeds, labor, and then physiological is how do we begin tolerance to higher plant density, stable harvest index, a tolerance of some of the photosynthetic system and grain numbers to stress. How do we really understand the stress dynamics of what goes on? A lot of us have spent a lot of time working on stress, and there's still opportunities in thinking about how do we do that. Soybeans, seed management, in terms of looking at just viability of germination in this, narrow rows, earlier planting, reduced tillage again, even in soybeans. Physiological improvements was, again, how do we manage these biological constraints and the stresses that go with that? And then a response of the plants to increase CO2 in all of this. But this interaction between CO2, temperature, and water aren't really understood. Developing countries, the yield gap is a potpourri of things, and it just lump it all into improved agronomic management. Anything that fits in improving agronomic management was shown to improve the yield gap or reduce the yield gap. In developed countries, it's really pretty interesting. There's no single identifiable factor. Again, wheat is generally growing in rain-fed areas. A lot of this is so weather dependent to going on. But the physiological improvements that we need to think about, increasing grain number, increasing grain weight, improved radiation use efficiency during grain fill. That was actually showed up on the small grains. Didn't show up on the corn and soybeans as much. But when we start thinking about how do we efficiently capture all the light that's out there. And I think that was really a piece that we have to work on from that standpoint. And then back to this whole G by E by M concept is that genetics by environment by management needs to be a way in which we think about the processes and how they interact. It's not a statistical design, it's a concept. And the interactions are probably more philosophical than thinking about what do some of these things play in all of this. And how do we begin to think about management practices that go with a particular system that allows us, again, to optimize those genetics that are out there? Here's our challenges. We need to still understand and quantify what limits yield. A lot of us have been at this for a long time. And yet, this is probably still one of the questions that are out there. There's a book that was written early 70s, the yield limitation factors. Mark, you remember that one? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was what, the early 70s?
Yes, I believe you're right.
You know, it was yield limiting factors and all this. It's probably time to revisit that. We need to develop, my pitch is that we probably need to develop a much more integrated program among agronomists, geneticists, pathologists, entomologists, weed scientists, nutritionists, understand this complex problem. And the reason I put nutritionists in this is that food security is not necessarily about quantity. It should be about quality. And we don't pay enough attention to thinking about the quality of what we're producing out there. We really think about the content of this from a protein standpoint, a number of different things that go with that. I think we really need to start bringing nutritionists into this. And then I think part of this is that we need to be willing to try some new approaches to how we reduce yield gaps, how do we increase yield stability. We know that when we go to changing production systems that we decrease the yield variation for year to year. And we decrease the yield variation from year to year on one simple factor, is that we've made more water available during that grain filling period. Because that's the number one factor that causes yield variation. That pays dividends, pays all these different processes that are going on. But I think we need to be even more imaginative in how we think about management in agricultural systems. How do we think about the genetics that go with that and all of this? And so I'm still very excited about this overall approach of how we begin to think about this from lots of different viewpoints. And the challenges are there, but I think the opportunities are really exist. We've got developed countries, we've got developing countries. All of us by 2050 would still like to eat, right? You know, you look at all this, I think that becomes our challenge is how do we feed this world that's got an increasing population, a decreasing soil resource, and all these other things that go with it. Instead of thinking about this from a negative point of view in terms of the dramatics of climate change, but think about it from the opportunities of what we can really use to make the most advantage of it. So with that, I'll entertain some questions. Jody.
If you could pick something, change about a modern corn hybrid, genetically, anything, no matter how hard, what would it be?
Why do we have to have it so tall? I mean, I've been looking at this, and I mean, I see a lot of hybrids that we're spending a lot of time growing biomass out there. And yet, we already intercept full light at LAI of 4, and we achieve that by the time we hit the ear leaf. So, can we make a shorter statured crop and still take the harvest index and really push it to the other side? Still have a big yield? And you'll tell me, no, we can't do that. But you
I think
asked.
we can. I think
Good.
we can. But I think the answer, part of the answer to your question, I think, is the biological relationship between number of leaves and height and flowering time. And then factor in the 30-inch rows, you've got to fill in that gap in there. And so if you're going to make it a lot shorter, I think you're going to wind up with fewer leaves, for one thing.
Why do we have to have 30-inch rows?
Well, I don't think we do.
You know, why can't we go to 20 or 15-inch rows? Sartorius.
So, thinking about the interactions, so if we go to a short corn and a higher harvest index, so what would be the biomass that will go into the soil organic carbon and the plant available water? So what do?
Well,
We pick something, we close the gaps, and then we degrade the soils further?
question for all of you.
Yeah.
Where's soil organic matter carbon come from?
Roots?
The roots. What's all that stuff laying on top of the ground do for you in terms of carbon? Don't say nothing. That's not where the source of organic carbon, but what it does is it modifies that microclimate of the soil. It basically is the coat that you put on when it finally gets cool. It modifies the temperature extremes, it modifies the moisture extremes, it allows the biology to work so that roots get dissolved very quickly. I don't know, if going back to the short statured corn, what would we do in terms of the root system, Jody? Yeah, we don't measure roots.
So just at Farm Progress Show last week, I had 2 individual farmers talk about how corn roots just aren't degrading like they used to. Is that a factor more of the genetics, or do we think that's changing environment? maybe that's part of the problem of our carbon issues. They just aren't degrading like they used to.
Well, I think some of that, my personal opinion, is the tolerances that we've put into that. And we've changed the lignin content. The producers always talk about stocks that don't degrade, things like this. We've got a lot of lignins built into that. We've made the corn plant so resistant to all the different things that are out there that it doesn't decay very quickly. I mean, you can find corn stalks from 2 years ago that are still out there. They're not as bad as they were, but they're still there. You know, farmers always complain about running corn stalks through tires because they're so tough. You know, so you look at all this. But I do think that these are one of the things that we need to look at is what is that degradation rate of our modern systems in roots. The other one that we throw out is why, and I'll just put this one out there, is why is a diverse rotation with corn, soybeans, and wheat so much more positive in the soil than a corn soybean system? I mean, what's magic about this small grain root system in improving the soil? But we see it all the time. We see it with a number of different things that we do in all of this. You know, you look at all this, and I think there's just a lot of interesting opportunities for questions and challenges. But you know, the question Jody asked is not an unrealistic one. You know, what could we reshape in that corn plant that maybe take better use of the advantage? How do we begin to look at a lot of these different processes that are going on? The most resistant corn that we had in an experiment that we ran where we kicked the temperatures up 4 degrees centigrade from normal Ames temperatures was the old XL45A, which some of us did our dissertation work on, so you know how old that hybrid is. You know, and it was a short statured broadleaf plant and everything else. And that's actually more tolerant to that high temperature stress than were the modern hybrids. And again, we see that in our when we start looking at the fluxes in the field, is that we get these stacked hybrids and everything, is that they tend to drop their photosynthetic rates a lot quicker when they hit stress, just because they have so much metabolic energy going in and try to protect everything. So, but again, that's a hypothesis, not a proven fact.
So,
Mark.
Dr. Hatfield, I really appreciate your focus on soils, managing soils, understanding soils, not only physical but biological. The pictures you put up there showed a lot of variability. So would your philosophy for a farmer to manage the whole field kind of best they can, or to do the site-specific stuff? You know, each soil type gets its own little management, or just go for the economic value of doing the whole field as best they can?
The heart of precision agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what that comes down to. If you really look at this, I had this argument with a producer in Illinois about precision agriculture, and that was, is the philosophy of precision agriculture to make that field uniform? Or is the philosophy of precision agriculture to optimize each soil within that field? Those are entirely two different management approaches to get there. Some people say, well, I need that field to look uniform. It looks uniform at Tasselm. I mean, it takes a little water to grow that crop up. Takes a little water, soil radiation to get that crop. So we can get that crop to full cover, you know, unless you really got that odd year that is really dramatic. I mean, fields are fairly uniform. So it depends on what point you look at in the season as to how well it works. But what we've been working with producers on is on those poor soils within the field. What's causing them to be poor? Are they poor in organic matter? Nutrients? You know, do we begin to optimize the performance in those by improving that part of the field? You know, some of the work, and a lot of you were at the seminar that Bruno gave last spring, right? On stable versus unstable zones within the field. I think there's a lot of merit in beginning looking at fields and saying, are there parts of that field that are relatively stable, no matter what we do to them, and there are parts of the field that are unstable. And if they're unstable, what's causing them to be unstable? And if they're and then do we have corrective actions that we could do? Or do we just reduce our inputs into that? And a lot of producers have gone to changing seeding rates, reducing fertilizers into that, basically saying, if you're not going to get a return out of that, why do you invest so much?
Right, invest more in the good field, good
Yeah.
part of the field.
And farmers try to manage the whole field uniformly, but we don't have to manage it on a square meter basis. We can manage it by soil types within that field, on the broad pieces that are, and probably return economic return to that field. But it becomes an interesting question that a lot of this is really this is the management piece that goes into that, and the management philosophy, and saying, how do we really begin to manage the field differently? And getting some producers to start working along with us to do that. I think it'd be a very exciting experiment to run, and say, how do we improve that? Or it's tutorials, you can just spin that up on the simulation model. That's where a lot of the stuff that we do in remote sensing is trying to have an impact. Saying, how do we look at the soils at the beginning of the season? How do we layer that and look at it throughout the whole season in terms of the dynamics, and then layer that back with the yield maps at the end of the season, saying, what are some of the paths that this has gone through in all of this?
We have lost a lot of soil carbon, and we are still losing it, and we may continue to lose it. So do you think that this is big piece of the puzzle for closing the yield gap?
I think soil carbon, soil water dynamics, nutrient cycling, all those things that go with a healthy soil are foundationally a management piece, that management environment interaction, and the environment piece is the soil piece, the management piece that goes with that, that'll go a long way towards closing the yield gap. Because if we look at that overall field basis, back to Mark's comment, if we look at that overall field as being a collection of lots of different soils, we begin to understand that if we improve parts of that soil or parts of that field with lower quality soils to make them better, we'll see a lot of this. And I have one example of that. We've been working with a young producer up by Sioux Center that we've gone to strip tilled manure, and we plant right on that strip the next spring. And after 3 years, we've got some really good soil in there, in all of this, really dark soil. But the more fascinating piece of that field is the yield gap, or the yield monitor. There's less than 20 bushels variation across half-mile fields. So we've made that field more uniform. But that soil responds. It's a Galba-Primgar soil. It's not really, doesn't have a lot of drainage problems. It needs organic matter. Very good in terms of water holding capacity, getting that water in. But we're surprised at how quickly we got that, as well as the change that was out there. Then we begin to see the response of getting organic matter back into that. Organic matter pays dividends in lots of different ways. Because that organic matter, in terms of the nutrient cycling at the end of the season, allows that crop to take every bit of advantage of available nutrients and available water. A lot of times we see systems running out of nutrients late in the season, but if you've got a biologically active soil, you've got a lot of cycling going on that makes nutrients available to that. So yeah, it's a piece I think we need to be spending time, but now working back the other way and saying, how do we begin to put it in the right place? I saw it. Did I see it? Oh, yes.
I have two questions. The first one is how to calculate the attainable yield. The second one, why it's increased linearly with time? That's the first question.
What was that now?
How to calculate the attainable yield?
Well, how to calculate the attainable yield?
Yeah, why it's increased linearly with time?
Oh, it's because all I do is I set the frontier of the highest yields that we get in every county. So that's why it's linear. You know, you could do it other ways. we just went with a very simple statistical approach on that. It seemed to work in all of this. So
Okay,
that's why it's linear. Because I made it linear.
The second question, can you explain again why use July maximum temperature but August minimum temperature?
Yeah, the August minimum temperature, one of the things that we see when we have high temperatures at night during August is that the plant becomes inefficient photosynthetically. What we're doing is basically when we've did a lot of our measurements in the field is that we have a whole set of profiles where we actually measure CO2 in corn canopies in the field. And when we get these real high August temperatures, we'll see CO2 levels within that canopy of 1,000 parts per million. We basically, and you back calculate, we've respired every bit of photosynthesis that we took up the day before, and we respired it back last night. So we didn't have anything left to put into grain. The other piece of this is that, and this is probably one of the more interesting things, is we know that growing degree days are how we add leaves to that plant. How do growing degree days add to the rapidity of the grain filling process? And what do they do in terms of the senescence process at the end of the season? Because you got that, now this double effect, is that we're maturing that grain more rapidly, but we're also making it more inefficient in terms of the grain process, or the grain filling. So we see smaller kernels. We see it on wheat. We just finished an experiment on wheat where we jumped up the temperatures 3 degrees centigrade from normal Salina, Kansas temperatures, the heart of the wheat belt. And we reduced the wheat yields in the normal versus the high temperatures by about 60%. And one of the factors that we changed in there was kernel size. What we're really doing is reducing the number of kernel, or reducing the weight per kernel. We see that same thing in corn. So we need to understand the senescence process. I think that's one of the interesting pieces we need to look at. Because we spend so much time thinking about how we grow that plant. I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how that plant senesces and how it responds to the different things that are going on. We haven't paid much attention to that. We talk about length of grain filling, things like this, but I think we need more attention on that. Other questions? Yeah.
So as a plant breeder, it seems like maybe we should be screening our material in more southerly environments because of this wave that's moving, right? Can you elaborate on that? And is that it?
I like to go south during the winter. Heck,
But it seems like to me that as this wave moves,
Yeah.
if we can advance in front of that wave, you know, we should be screening our material.
and the higher temperature events.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's one alternative we could do in terms of looking at that, is saying, you know, do we go to a more harsh environment? There's been a lot of, but I don't know, we haven't analyzed enough of the G-bite genomics to field to see if that would really hold true on some of the inbreds that are out there, Jody. I mean, that G-bite experiment, or genomics to field experiment will help explain some of that. Should we be changing? But I mean, you look at this harsh environment, it does really kick a lot of plants by the wayside, saying, you know, they just can't cope with this. You know, how way you project, and moving it into southern environments, which got a photoperiod effect.
Sure.
That's out there as well.
I mean, you can go south of Des Moines and you get totally different environment.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Torres, you get the last question.
Yeah, so I will go to this graph with the 16 years of data and carbon balance.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see any variation with depth in terms of carbon loss? It was substantial carbon loss from the bottom, or it was mostly from the top? Or it was
Dr. Sauer.
Why is it Christian here?
Yeah, why isn't Christian?
There was change in both inorganic and organic carbon in the profile.
And it really was up and down the whole profile. That's what we're surprised. It wasn't just near the plow there. We were seeing losses deep down as well. And we just have that, and we just finished all the different depth by depth. We've done the same thing with our field we just took over, where we've got the conventional field, and now we have a field that is a transition field to no-till with a cover crop. And so we have the same flux measurements in that. And after 1 year, we already begin to see a little difference in the net ecosystem productivity. We changed in carbon balance, not because we were adding more carbon, but because we had the cover crop residue and things like this, we were affecting the energy balance. So we see that piece. But yeah, it's a good question. We haven't spent enough time looking and saying where are we really changing this.
All right, let's go ahead and thank Dr. Hatfield.
Thank you, Jerry. You're welcome. Very, very nice. I'm so glad you played me.